When we look at food, we're going to look primarily at the three macronutrients, the three primary macronutrients. We have carbohydrate, protein, and fat. When we call something a macronutrient, we mean that it's one of the things that is a significant source of calories in the diet. So when we think about food, we think about we think of food as fuel, right? We don't necessarily eat food because we think of it being fuel. We eat food for a whole bunch of social and emotional reasons and all that, often without thinking about it, okay? But when we think about food, we tend to think about it as a fuel. But I think it's also important that we think about food as a drug. And that's what I'm going to talk about here a little bit, because as we talk about the effects of the different components of our diet, they have an influence on these hormones that is very analogous to the way different kinds of drugs can affect various processes in our body. So when we eat carbohydrate, carbohydrate is built up of sugars, including very much glucose. When we eat a given carbohydrate, if you imagine that I eat a carbohydrate that is something that is broken down quickly in our body, something that we would call high glycemic index, and I'll talk about that more in just a second. But when we eat a carbohydrate that is broken down quickly by our body, that carbohydrate shows up in our bloodstream very quickly as glucose. So you can imagine this is glucose levels and this is time. We eat, say, 100 calories of white bread, and our glucose levels go up very quickly and then come back down very quickly. Does that make sense? We eat something of low glycemic index, something that takes much longer to get broken down and released into our bloodstream as glucose. That tends to cause a much longer, slower release, never achieving anything like these high levels of glucose that we see with the high glycemic index. So this is like broccoli. Right? If we ate the same number of calories of each of these, the same calories of white bread as broccoli, the area under these two curves should be the same. Right? Still the same total amount of glucose that gets released into our blood, just the timing of it is markedly different. So you can imagine, we know that insulin is released into our body in response to the eating of glucose. So our insulin levels are actually going to somewhat mirror these high glucose levels. They're going to go up really high and then crash quickly when we've eaten something of high glycemic index. And they're going to tend to follow the same sort of curve when we've eaten something of low glycemic index. What happens here, if you think about, like if we just ate carbohydrate and nothing else, our glucose levels go up and then come really down. One of the responses to low glucose levels is hunger. So we get hungry again very quickly because we've eaten this high glycemic index carbohydrate, and we want to eat again. And that puts us in this situation where, say we eat that same high carbohydrate again, it spikes us up. We do it again, it spikes us up. Okay, you can kind of see this pattern that could be set up by eating things of high glycemic index. The problem is that there's sort of this threshold value here that when we're above it, when we're in these areas where the glucose and therefore insulin levels are very high, those glucose and insulin actually have negative effects on the walls of the blood vessels in our body. We end up with all kinds of vascular disease as a result of having these really high levels of insulin and glucose. Things that we can avoid by, number one, eating low glycemic index foods. When I talked about protein, I talked about glucagon. Glucagon has a little bit of an antagonistic effect to insulin. And so it is released somewhat in response to low glucose. It's also released in response to eating protein. If we eat protein in our meal with our carbohydrate, it tends to blunt the effect of these peaks because we've got that antagonistic hormone present in reasonably high levels, not just here when the insulin's low, but here when the insulin's high. So we kind of have that antagonism, and it reduces some of the toxic effects that occurs at these high peaks. Also, what's very key that's related here is when we eat those carbohydrate and protein and ideally fat including meals, because we avoid these high peaks and then these crashes. There have actually been some great studies done on kids. It shows that kids that eat a really high carbohydrate breakfast with little protein and fat in it, you know, the classic healthy orange juice, oatmeal toast, and a banana kind of thing, those kids, because they get hungry again faster, snack more, and they actually end up consuming more calories over the course of the day than if their morning breakfast included balanced proportions of this carbohydrate, protein, and fat. So what we're trying to avoid is this cycling kind of effect. Fat plays a very important role in all of this in that it's just kind of a damper on everything. If we eat carbohydrate with fat, a high glycemic index carbohydrate with fat, it tends to slow how quickly that high glycemic index carbohydrate gets absorbed, and it tends to smooth this out. You can potentially end up with sort of more of a this-looking curve. What we'd really like to do is eat low glycemic index carbohydrates with protein and with fat in every meal, so that what we do is we have this very nicely regulated sort of lower level of our glucose and subsequently insulin levels. Guys have questions about that just basic framework, sort of basic concept? It's all about trying to really regulate these glucose levels, the subsequent insulin levels, and keeping those in a range that's safe and really going to help optimize our performance. And we'll talk a lot more about performance here shortly.